Hey everyone, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving straight into a fascinating source report that makes some honestly explosive claims about what's happening behind the scenes in global diplomacy. We're talking about massive shifts that are sending absolute shockwaves from Washington to Delhi and all the way over to Beijing. These are the kinds of maneuvers that could literally reshape global stability as we know it. So we've broken down all the key takeaways from this report to help us make sense of this giant, incredibly complex geopolitical chessboard. All right, let's jump right in.
Okay, let's tackle this head-on. The source report hits us right away with a massive, incredibly urgent question. Has Putin actually made up his mind to stop the war? You know, after all the devastation, all the entrenched positions we've seen, the report suggests we might actually be witnessing a pivot, as the sheer gridlock of the Ukraine conflict finally forced Moscow to seriously look at a path to peace. The report frames this as the central mystery behind all these recent diplomatic moves, and it all hinges on a few unexpected names popping up.
So, let's look at part 1, the surprise move, Victory Day revelations.
Now, traditionally, Russia's Victory Day, the day commemorating the Soviet Union's win over Nazi Germany, is all about loud celebrations, roaring tanks, the whole shebang of military hardware. But the source points out a really stark contrast this time around. The real action wasn't the noise of the military parade. Actually, it was the quiet, calculated maneuvers happening over at the diplomatic table. Putin used this highly symbolic day to shock the world with a diplomatic revelation, rather than just flexing military muscle.
And he didn't just give some vague talk about peace either. He explicitly announced that Russia has started working on a coordinated strategy with nations that he specifically labeled as friends. And crucially, he publicly named the People's Republic of China and India, right alongside the United States, as his key partners in finding a solution. Think about that for a second. In a world completely divided by this conflict, openly declaring that you're relying on these specific global superpowers for a peace framework, that is a massive shift in rhetoric.
But why did Putin specifically name the U.S., or more accurately, certain figures in the U.S.? That brings us to part 2, the Trump factor, a new proposal.
At the dead center of this new proposal is the number 3. Putin announced he's ready for a 3-day ceasefire. But here's the kicker, and the report is very clear on this. Putin explicitly stated that this 3-day ceasefire plan was originally proposed by Donald Trump. He didn't just agree to it, he actively praised it, which sends a huge signal that he's willing to engage with specific political factions over in the West. And this brilliantly illustrates what else is on the table, because alongside that 3-day ceasefire is a massive companion plan. We're talking about a prisoner exchange involving 1,000 captives from both sides. It's a very specific, tangible step toward de-escalation. And again, the source claims this is directly tied to that same Trump framework.
The source makes a really distinct observation here about all this. Putin appears to be giving way more weight to Donald Trump's proposals than to anything coming from the current U.S. administration. The report notes that Putin specifically praised Trump's proposal for being built on a humanitarian basis and a shared respect for history. Now, whether this is a genuine agreement or just a calculated geopolitical wedge strategy to stir the pot, the report frames it as a very deliberate connection Putin is trying to make between future U.S. politics and global peace.
Now we need to shift gears a bit because the report also highlights a very serious threat. Part 3, the hidden warning, embassy dangers.
The source points out a pretty grim tactical reality on the ground right now. Moscow recently issued a direct warning about the physical location of foreign embassies situated in Kyiv. These diplomatic missions are sitting perilously close to Ukraine's military decision-making and command centers. And Moscow's warning was absolutely blunt. If things escalate and Russia decides to strike those command centers, those nearby foreign missions could easily get caught in the crossfire.
So the crucial point is, who exactly got this warning? The report explicitly lists 3 nations that Moscow reached out to: India, China, and the United States. The logic here, according to the source, is that Russia supposedly doesn't want to accidentally harm the missions of its friends or completely inflame tensions with major global powers over collateral damage. But this leaves us with a deeply concerning dual narrative, right? On one hand, you have to ask, is this an honest heads up? Like a genuine attempt by Moscow to protect the assets of nations it considers friends? Or is this a calculated, deliberate geopolitical threat? Basically a way of saying, hey, we're about to escalate and nobody in Kyiv is safe, using the safety of foreign diplomats to pressure these huge nations into forcing Ukraine to the negotiating table. The source leaves this tension totally open for us to ponder.
To really understand how these nations might react, we have to look at Part 4, the global position, India's role.
We really need to anchor this analysis with a very famous quote from Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. "This is not an era of war." The source notes that this simple yet incredibly powerful statement has consistently validated India's peace-driven stance throughout all of this. And what's super interesting is that the report suggests Vladimir Putin has increasingly begun to accept and even publicly acknowledge the weight of this exact sentiment, using it to frame his own recent diplomatic overtures.
Now, what's really interesting about this is the concept of strategic autonomy. The source actually credits this exact doctrine for India's current success on the world stage. Strategic autonomy is basically a nation's ability to pursue its own interests without being dictated to by foreign powers or getting locked into rigid alliances. And because India has fiercely maintained this autonomy, they've achieved something incredibly rare here. They are actually being listened to by both Russia and the West.
According to the report, this delicate, incredibly complex balancing act elevates India's status on the global stage significantly. The analysis portrays India not just as some neutral bystander, but actually functioning as a Vishwaguru, a world teacher, stepping right into the role of a crucial diplomatic peacemaker. They are protecting their own national interests while simultaneously acting as a trusted conduit between two sides that are otherwise deeply entrenched in conflict.
Building off that, the source ventures into some really fascinating speculation. Looking at Putin's recent statements and this highly targeted diplomatic outreach, the report asks if we are actually witnessing the conceptual formation of a new quadrilateral geopolitical alliance. Basically, an informal grouping of Putin, Trump, Modi, and China's Xi Jinping. The source explicitly questions whether this specific configuration of leaders with their unique global leverage might literally be the exact combination required to finally halt this devastating war.
Which brings us to the final phase, Part 5, the next move in diplomacy.
At this point, the report argues that Putin has essentially forced a response by publicly putting a ceasefire on the table, suggesting a massive prisoner swap, and simultaneously giving that dark warning about escalating strikes near embassies. Putin has placed the ball firmly in the court of Ukraine and the Western powers. Moscow has made its opening gambit. Now the whole world is watching to see if the West and Kyiv are going to engage with this new diplomatic reality or just reject it entirely.
And that brings us to the exact, provocative question the source leaves hanging in the air. Is this move by Putin a masterstroke? Is it a brilliant piece of geopolitical chess that divides his enemies, elevates his allies, and secures a favorable peace? Or is it just a desperate bluff masking as diplomacy? We've laid out the board and the claims from the report, but it's up to you to think critically about the underlying motives here. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and definitely keep questioning what you see on the board.